I got involved with the project when Katie Martin approached me and asked me to be her mentor for her history honors thesis project. And she probably approached me because of my expertise in 20th century U.S. history and generally and specifically Indiana history, because the project that she wanted to pursue was about the Civilian Conservation Corps.
The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, was a New Deal agency created in 1933 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to combat the effects of the Great Depression. It put young men aged 18 to 25 back to work on public lands, and so they often completed public works projects such as building roads, bridges, hiking trails, and building recreational facilities on public lands, so like national parks and state parks.
We certainly know about the Civilian Conservation Corps nationally. We also know about its presence in the state, the Civilian Conservation Corps camps. We also know that the races were segregated and that men were assigned to camps based on their race in this period. So we know that there were certain camps that African American men were assigned to. But Katie was able to get a perspective on their experience that nobody has written about.
Company 517C was a group of African American men who worked in South Bend, Portland, and Obannon Woods State Park from 1933 to 1942. And they were a Civilian Conservation Corps company, only one of 8 African American groups in Indiana, and the rest of the Indiana Civilian Conservation groups were white. Company 517C was a group of African American men, and there were very few African American CCC companies because it was often difficult to site their camps near white communities, and so they would often have to work in national parks or state forests or state parks just to be away from the white communities. When the company moved to Portland, Indiana, there was a lot of talk in the company or in the newspaper of Portland, and people were saying that they didn't want to have the camp located near their homes because they thought that they would have drinking issues or violence, and obviously the Civilian Conservation Corps men were really chosen for their good nature and their good qualities. Company 517C dealt with racial issues by speaking out in their own company newspapers, and so these newspapers were called Camp Chatter, Wyandotte Wahoo, and Ditch Dots and Dashes. And they wrote poetry, they had news from around the camp, like gossip, and they also talked about racial issues because it was basically a forum for their own ideas about racial identity and anything else they wanted to discuss. And so sometimes these newsletters or these newspapers would have events about things happening in the local community, and so it would also be published in the local community paper, but it was really a platform for them to discuss their own issues. On December 30th, 1939, Marshall Carter, who was a young Civilian Conservation Corps man in 517C, was walking out of Portland, Indiana, back to the CCC camp when a Portland citizen shot him in the chest just because he was walking on his property. And he was rushed back to the Civilian Conservation Corps camp, and the camp commander immediately performed first aid, and he miraculously survived, but there was no mention of it in the National Civilian Conservation Corps newspaper, and there was really no backlash against the white citizen. The shooting of Marshall Carter really brought the morale down of the Civilian Conservation Corps company. They spoke out in their newspaper and talked about how they wanted to basically advance civil rights for African Americans, and they also wrote poetry that expressed their sadness that he was shot. And you can really tell in the December newspaper that they're really depressed by the shooting. A lot of men from Company 517C went on to have success later in life. Some owned their own businesses. One man owned a flagpole company. Some went into education, and so they worked in school systems. And William S. Myers actually went on to be a firefighter, and he was really involved in the civic life of Indianapolis. And so now you can go view his papers at the Indianapolis Historical Society. I hope that readers of my article take away that racial issues were being fought for in the 1930s and didn't start with the civil rights movement. And also every time you visit a national park or a state park, that you really look at all the recreational facilities and the roads and think about all the work that went into them. And especially a lot of them were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps.